Welcome back. Today, we explore the early years of one of America's most iconic figures, George Washington. Long before the presidency, before the Revolution, Washington was a young, inexperienced officer facing the dangers of a brutal frontier war. These early battles would shape his destiny and the future of a nation. At just 21 years old, Washington stepped into a conflict that would soon explode into a global war. He made bold decisions, dangerous mistakes, and survived moments that should have killed him. This is the untold story of how the French and Indian War forged the leader who would become the first president of the United States. In the early 1750s, the Ohio River Valley became the center of a fierce struggle between empires. Britain wanted to expand west, France wanted to connect its territories from Canada to Louisiana, and native nations fought to defend their homelands. Tension rose with every passing month. Virginia's lieutenant governor needed someone young and fearless to deliver a message to the French: leave the territory or face war. He chose George Washington. This would be Washington's first major test. In the winter of 1753, Washington traveled through forests, frozen rivers, and dangerous terrain to reach the French forts. He delivered Britain's warning, but the French refused to leave. Washington returned home without a victory, but he returned with something far more important: confidence, recognition, and a growing desire for military glory. In the spring of 1754, Washington marched back into the wilderness with a small force of soldiers. His orders were vague, and in the frontier, vague orders often led to violence. On May 28th, his native ally, the Half-King, guided him to a small French camp. At dawn, Washington's troops opened fire. The French commander, Joseph Coulon de Jumonville, was killed. To the French, it was an assassination. To the British, it was a military encounter. But to history, it was the spark that ignited the French and Indian War. Suddenly, a 22-year-old officer from Virginia found himself at the center of a global conflict. The French quickly struck back. Outnumbered and underprepared, Washington built a small, makeshift fort in a muddy clearing. He called it Fort Necessity. But the location was terrible. Rain filled the trenches. The fort was easy to surround, and on July 3, 1754, French forces and their native allies attacked. Gunpowder became soaked. Food ran low. Washington's men were overwhelmed. By evening, Washington was forced to surrender, one of the only surrenders of his entire life. The French surrender document, written in French, contained a statement claiming Washington had assassinated Jumonville. Not understanding the language, Washington signed it. News spread across Europe. A young colonial officer was now tied to the beginning of a global war. Washington returned to Virginia humiliated, but more determined than ever. A year later, British General Edward Braddock arrived with a massive army. Washington joined him as an aide, hoping to redeem himself. Braddock believed European tactics would easily defeat the French, but deep in the American wilderness, those rigid formations proved fatal. Near the Monongahela River, the British walked into a deadly ambush. Gunfire burst from the trees. British lines collapsed. Officers fell one after another. Chaos consumed the forest. General Braddock was mortally wounded. Yet in the middle of the disaster, Washington remained calm. He rode back and forth across the battlefield, giving orders, rallying frightened soldiers, and helping save what remained of the army. 2 horses were shot from under him. 4 bullets tore through his coat, but none touched him. This moment changed everything. Washington was no longer seen as a failed officer from Fort Necessity. He was respected as a brave and steady leader under fire. The war continued for years, and Washington learned lessons that would shape the rest of his life. He studied frontier warfare, fast, mobile, and unpredictable. He saw the importance of native alliances. He witnessed the flaws of traditional European military tactics, and he experienced the arrogance many British officers held toward colonial soldiers. He learned discipline, he learned strategy, and most importantly, he learned from his failures. These experiences would guide him decades later during the American Revolution. By the end of the French and Indian War, Washington was no longer the inexperienced young officer who stumbled into conflict. He was a battle-tested commander who had survived defeat, chaos, and near-death experiences. Without these early trials, there may never have been a General Washington or a President Washington. The war didn't just reshape North America, it shaped the man who would one day lead a revolution and define a nation.